How's your heart today? Some love does not arrive loudly enough to be recognized right away. It stays in the background of ordinary days, in errands, timing, check-ins, familiar seats, and all the small gestures we only understand later. Tonight is for the kinds of love that never fully announce themselves, but still left a shape behind. Not every meaningful bond asks for a declaration. Sometimes it simply asks to be noticed, even if the noticing comes late. The first letter is for a sister whose love was so practical, it took years to understand how tender it really was. I never said I love you first, because in our family, love usually arrived disguised as instructions. You are my older sister, which meant that for most of my life, I confused your care with bossiness. You reminded me to bring my keys. You corrected my grammar in texts. You asked whether I had eaten in a tone that made it sound like a performance review. If mom was soft, you were efficient. If dad was quiet, you were exact. You folded affection into sentences that sounded practical enough to survive our family. At 16, I found this annoying. At 22, I called it your personality. At 29, I finally understood it was one of the purest forms of love I had ever been given. When we were younger, you used to wait for me after school even when your own classes ended later. You always pretended it was no trouble. You stood near the gate with your backpack half-zipped, looking mildly irritated in the way only older sisters can, as if my existence had mildly inconvenienced you in theory but not in practice. On the walk home, you never asked if I had a good day in a soft emotional voice. You asked whether I had enough money left on my transit card, whether I turned in the form mom signed, whether that one girl in my class was still being weird. Your love was always like that. Specific, alert, slightly disguised. When I moved to another city for work, we became the kind of siblings who texted more than we called. Even then, your care arrived in useful shapes. A screenshot of a cheaper train route. A message that said, "Rain tomorrow, wear real shoes." A grocery voucher sent out of nowhere with the excuse, "You looked broke in your last selfie." I always replied with jokes because that was the language we had. Humor let us keep the tenderness moving without looking at it directly. Then I had a hard year. Nothing dramatic enough to explain cleanly. Just the kind of year that wears you down from many directions at once. Work got unstable. My rent went up. I was sleeping lightly and waking tired. I told everyone I was managing because that word makes struggle sound temporary and adult. I didn't want to sound ungrateful, dramatic, or young in the wrong way. So I edited myself. I answered with busy, fine, and just tired. You were the only one who didn't seem fully convinced. One Tuesday evening, after I had ignored a few messages and skipped dinner because I was too drained to decide what to make, my doorbell rang. Outside was a grocery bag with soup, fruit, instant noodles, and the expensive crackers I only buy when I am either sick or sad. There was no note. Just one message from you. "Don't make this a thing, eat first." I sat on the floor in my kitchen and laughed in the middle of crying, which felt embarrassingly on brand for us. Of course that was how you would do it. No speech, no forced emotional opening. No, "I'm worried about you," typed into a phone. Just food at the door and instructions that made room for me without demanding a performance in return. The next morning, you texted, "Did you heat the soup properly or are you being reckless?" I wrote back, "You're unbearable." What I meant was thank you for noticing without making me explain the whole map of my exhaustion before receiving care. A few weeks later, I went home for a weekend. You were there with your hair tied up, helping mom cut fruit while pretending not to criticize the way I chopped onions. At dinner, you asked what time my train back was the next day. Then you told me to send a photo when I got home, because, as you put it, "I don't trust your sense of direction after dark." Everyone laughed. I did too. But something in me went quiet in a new way. I realized that so much of the love I depend on in life does not sound poetic at all. It sounds like reminders. It sounds like logistical concern. It sounds like someone tracking the weather in your city and pretending they only happen to notice. It sounds like soup at the door and an insult attached, so you don't feel too fragile receiving it. I think I spent too long waiting for love to sound softer than it often does in real life. I thought tenderness had to be verbal, obvious, and emotionally fluent. I did not understand that some people, especially the people who grew up beside us, build care into habit because habit is sturdier than a mood. What I never told you is that you became one of the reasons I stopped confusing independence with isolation. You taught me that being loved does not always feel like being held. Sometimes it feels like being remembered in exact, useful ways. Sometimes, it feels like someone already knowing which crackers to buy when the week has emptied you out. I never said that your love made me feel less alone in my own adulthood, even while you continued delivering it in the form of mild insults and weather warnings. I never said that for all our sarcasm, you have always been one of the safest people in my life. The truth I carried was simple. I knew your love was real long before I learned how to name it. I just wish I had thanked you before I got so good at relying on it. Some love never says the sentence, it just remembers the details. The quietest love is often the kind that already knows what to bring before we know how to ask. The next letter is for a person who was called a friend because that was the safest word available at the time. I never told you that you became the person I saved the softest part of my day for. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single dramatic moment where music swelled and my whole inner life stood up in recognition. It happened the way many real things happen, slowly, repeatedly, almost invisibly, at first. We met at work, which already makes the story sound more ordinary than it felt from the inside. Same building, different teams. We started with elevator conversations and bad coffee, then a few lunches. Then the kind of easy messaging that begins with practical things and quietly drifts elsewhere. At some point, without either of us saying so, you became the person I wanted to tell things to before the feeling of them had even fully settled. That is still how I define closeness. Not who you can call in an emergency. Who you instinctively reach for with a tiny story that doesn't need rescuing, only witnessing. You knew my day in pieces. The coworker I avoided. The train line that always ran late on Thursdays. The fact that I hated grocery shopping when I was already tired because choosing dinner felt like too much personality for one evening. I knew your rhythms too. Which family calls drained you? Which meetings left you sarcastic for an hour afterward? Which song you played when you needed to reset? We were not dramatic with each other. We were daily. That was the dangerous beauty of it. You started appearing in the most unremarkable corners of my life. A second coffee bought automatically because I knew you were running late and would skip lunch if nobody intervened. A seat saved on the train, a text that said nothing but, "Take your time," on days when the city felt too loud. If someone had asked me then whether I was in love with you, I would have said no too quickly. Not because the feeling wasn't there, but because it was quieter than what I thought love was supposed to look like. I thought love needed more certainty, more chaos, or at least more formal naming. Instead, mine looked like attention, like relief when you were near, like the way my voice changed when I talked to you at the end of a hard day. Softer, less defended, more like myself. There was one evening that returns to me often. We had both stayed late and left the building at the same time. Tired in that specific office way where your body feels both heavy and slightly unreal. Rain had started while we were inside, and we stood beneath the awning deciding whether to wait it out or pretend we were the kind of people who don't mind getting wet. You laughed at something small I said and then asked, "Do you want company on the walk, or quiet?" I remember that exact sentence, because it held such unusual gentleness. Not pressure, not assumption, just room. I said, "Company." So we walked. Not quickly, not romantically enough to name. We talked about dinner, mothers, late rent payments, whether adults ever fully get used to being tired. At some point you took my umbrella because I kept tilting it the wrong way and getting half my shoulder soaked. You did it so casually that it took me several seconds to understand why my chest had tightened. It was not the umbrella. It was the feeling of being handled with care so natural it didn't need announcement. I think I knew then. Not in a cinematic way. In a human way. The quiet way you know something has become important because losing access to it suddenly feels imaginable. But life was not arranged for grand confession. You were considering a move. I was barely stable in my own life. We were both adults with practical concerns and enough self-awareness to understand that timing matters, and that not every feeling should be handed to another person just because it is sincere. There are honest things that can still be unfair when spoken at the wrong moment. So I stayed quiet. I told myself it was maturity, and maybe some of it was. But some of it was fear too. Fear of changing the room. Fear of naming something beautiful before it had figured out what it was. Fear that once the feeling had language, it might also require a future I could not responsibly ask for. Then you moved. Not very far at first, just far enough to make daily life stop offering you to me so easily. Our messages remained warm. We still checked in. But one of the hardest truths about distance is that affection can survive while immediacy cannot. You were no longer inside my day by default. Reaching for you became a decision instead of a reflex. That is when I understood how much of my love had been built out of ordinary access. One Saturday I bought 2 coffees on instinct, walked half a block, and only then remembered I was alone. I stood there on the sidewalk with both cups cooling in my hands and felt foolish in a way that was strangely tender. Not because I had been rejected. Not because some tragic ending had taken place. Just because my body had learned your presence faster than my mind had admitted what it meant. What I never told you is that you changed my definition of love. Before you, I thought love had to be loud enough to prove itself. After you, I understood that some of the deepest feelings are quiet because they live in attention, timing, and emotional safety more than spectacle. I never said that when something beautiful happened, my first happiness was often that I would get to tell you later. I never said that the reason your messages mattered was not frequency, but texture. I felt more like myself in them. And I never said the sentence that might have made things more complicated, but also more honest. By the time I realized I loved you, the love had already become too gentle to force into a shape it hadn't chosen. Maybe that is why I still think of you kindly instead of painfully. Nothing was broken. Something real simply stayed quiet. Sometimes love doesn't go unspoken because it isn't deep enough. Sometimes it stays quiet because it was too careful to ask for more than life could hold. Not every love is meant to become a story with a label. Some of it simply teaches us what tenderness feels like and leaves us changed. The last letter is for the person I did love out loud, but not fully enough in the small moments that mattered most. I never told you that the quietest parts of our relationship were the ones that healed me. When people talk about love, they usually remember the large scenes. First dates, first kisses, big conversations, endings. But when I think of you now, what returns first are the domestic things. The way you rinsed fruit before putting it in a bowl. The way you knocked lightly on the bathroom door before coming in, even after years together. The way you placed a glass of water on my side of the bed if I'd had a long day and forgotten to drink enough. I noticed those things at the time, but I don't think I understood how much they were doing for me. We met in a season when I was more defended than I looked. From the outside I was functioning well enough. Working, showing up, making plans, answering messages with the right amount of warmth. But underneath, I was tired in ways I had learned to hide early. I thought being lovable meant being easy to be around. I thought needing less made me more mature. You never argued with those beliefs directly. You just lived beside me long enough for them to soften. Your love was not dramatic, thank God for that. You learned my silences without treating them like puzzles to solve. You could tell the difference between my quiet that meant peace and my quiet that meant I was sinking a little. On those evenings, you never arrived with speeches. You asked simple things. Do you want tea? Want me to sit with you? Have you eaten anything besides toast? Looking back, I see how much mercy there was in being cared for without being overexposed. What makes this difficult to write is that we did love each other, truly. That part was never the lie. But real love is not always enough to keep two people moving in the same direction. Your work pulled one way, mine pulled another. Family needs changed. Timelines shifted. We became tired in different languages. Even before the ending, I think we both knew something. Had started asking more of us than we could generously give. Still, I wish I had said more while we were inside it. I wish I had told you that some of the safest moments of my adult life happened in our kitchen on completely forgettable evenings. leftovers, socks on the floor, one of us half listening to a podcast while the other complained about work. Nothing anyone would frame as romance. Yet that was where I felt most tenderly restored. Not in the exciting parts, in the repeated parts. There was one night near the end when I came home late and exhausted, already apologizing for being distant all week. You were sitting at the table eating soup. You looked up and said, "There's more on the stove if you want some." No guilt, no performance, just space. I sat down across from you, and for a few minutes we ate in that soft domestic quiet that had carried us through so much. I remember wanting to say something important, not about the future, not about fixing anything, just something accurate and overdue. I wanted to say, "Thank you for loving me," in a way that let my nervous system rest. That is a strange sentence to think at a dinner table, and maybe that's why it stayed inside me. When we ended, it was sad but not cruel. We were both gentle, which made the loss cleaner and stranger at the same time. People understand betrayal more easily than they understand parting with someone who was kind to you. For a while I didn't know where to put that grief. There was no villain, only absence. Only the quiet task of relearning a life that had once been shared in ordinary ways. Now, enough time has passed that I can see the gift more clearly than the ache. You taught me that love does not always need to be spectacular to be life-changing. Sometimes the most healing thing another person can do is make daily life feel less sharp, less defended, less lonely in the body. What I never told you is that you changed how I love people now. I refill water glasses. I listen for the difference between tired and overwhelmed. I ask smaller questions. I leave more room, not because I am copying you exactly, but because once you have been loved in a calm way, your own hands remember. I also never said that even after the relationship ended, I didn't think of our quietness as failure. I thought of it as proof that love can be gentle all the way through, even when it cannot remain. The sentence I carried but did not speak clearly enough was this: the most important thing you gave me was not excitement. It was the feeling that being cared for could be peaceful. And that kind of love may stay quiet, but it does not stay small. If these letters touch something in you tonight, maybe it's because quiet love often shapes us more deeply than loud love ever could. The people who cared for us, gently, specifically, and without much spectacle, have a way of staying in our nervous systems long after the moment has passed. Even when the words were few, the meaning was real. Sometimes understanding comes late, but late understanding can still soften a life. If this stayed with you, stay with mind light. Leave your own thoughts below, and be kind to the quiet loves that helped make you who you are. Some of them were never fully spoken, but they still warmed the room.